to conferences.
Hi everyone, this is Sidra Iqbal here, and you're watching us live on the School of Tomorrow. This is a flagship online event that talks about the future of learning, unlearning, and relearning. Of course, we've gone through the 2 years of the pandemic, and we're slowly trying to get out of that trauma. There have been some very powerful sessions lined up, and thank you for being a part and being connected. The one we are now getting into is going to unpack and talk about a very powerful theme. Despite all our progress and a number of legal, frameworks and protection mechanisms available to the citizens and specifically the women in Pakistan, we still see a very toxic environment when it comes to victim blaming, victim shaming. Somehow or the other, once the news actually goes into the deeper end, we realize that the women victim find little support when it comes to their own immediate support network, even when it comes to the larger society. So where are we going wrong, and what more can be done to actually give that kind of support, to actually reduce the instances of violence and harassment against women? What is our social understanding? There is a legal definition that we attach to what is acceptable and not acceptable, the constitutional rights, the human rights. But in terms of us as a society, what is our norm? Why is it normal and why is it acceptable to hit a woman, to be violent towards her, or to not take her no or her opinion as a final word? So we're going to dive deep into this. We have a brilliant panel here with us, a multi-stakeholder environment. They've all been strong advocates. They've been working in their own capacities to actually uphold the highest ideals, to raise awareness, and to work towards concrete, substantive change. I'm very happy to introduce my panel to you. First and foremost, an educationist, excellence, an activist, and advocate we have with us, Ms. Neelam Hussain. Thank you so much, ma'am, for joining us this afternoon. We also have with us Nida Usman, who's the founder of Women in Law Pakistan. Again, the legal framework. A lot of times, a woman may have access to legal help and support, but she doesn't find that support system and an advocate who really truly understands her pain and her situation. So thank you so much, Nida, for joining in and for talking about that. And then, of course, we have the very amazing, the person who's been working at the helm of things, who's been actually been seeing how it's all shaping up and has a major contribution towards her. She is, of course, the chair of the Punjab Commission of Status of Women. Ms. Fawzia Wakar is also with us. Thank you, Fawzia, for making time for us. And last but definitely not the least, we wouldn't want you to get an impression that we are biased against the men. So we decided to have the one and only, the champion who talks about how you can be in your most enlightened, in your most evolved masculine energy, and has been talking about this subject for a while. Actor, director par excellence, Adnan Malik also joins us. Thank you all for being here. Maybe dive into this by first getting some reflections and your thoughts as to how our society actually understands harassment. What is harassment to them and what is a norm? At times, your inner voice may be screaming. You may think that something is subliminally or at a subconscious level is not right, because usually you don't get the worst happening over just a day. It builds up. So how do we learn to ignore those small triggers, and what does the society actually say about it? Nida, if I may request you to open and talk about how the society views harassment.
Thank you so much, Sidra, for the opportunity, and to Beacon House for creating space for us to talk about something which is so important, and which obviously needs more platforms, because as the topic today itself is, we're talking about narratives here, and we're talking about narratives which are coming from those who control most of the resources. And as Karl Marx says, that the ideas of the ruling class are the ideas of the elite, those who are in control of the methods of production as well. So harassment, obviously, again, unfortunately, has been one of those issues that has been channelized in the society with the same lens of those who are in a domineering position. And therefore, the experience of a woman of what harassment is and what it entails will definitely be very different from how it has been conceived or portrayed, or how even in the law, for example, um, the law is seriously inadequate when it comes to the definition of what harassment is. And I would like to definitely say over here that even our laws and whatever social sort of view that we have about these issues are also coming from the influence of the dominant ideology that is prevalent. So all of these are then reflected into our, into our laws as well. And that is basically what I'd like to start off with, because I know that, there's a whole we have a whole panel talking about how this whole narrative is skewed and how it mutually reinforces the dominance and control. But I'll leave that for Miss Neelam to build on that.
Yeah.
But essentially, how we view harassment right now is literally from two different aspects. One is how women view it, and how the understanding that then is promoted through the media, through our dramas, which is obviously coming from a more domineering perspective of men and patriarchy in particular.
That's very interesting because the key takeaway is indeed, as you said, that harassment ties in with the mechanisms of control and who's in the dominating position and power. Just like you said, may I take this to Miss Leenam now? We were having this offline conversation, and you reiterated that blame is in fact a mechanism of control. How do you see that playing out in terms of, especially with reference to violence against women and instances of harassment, Ms. Leenam?
But as I said, I mean, uh, blame is a very simple knee-jerk reaction of any human being to pass the buck, to not take responsibility for their action. Okay, it was something like you sneezed and I spilt my tea. It's your fault. You
Mm.
sneezed. But that is a very, I mean, that is a basic kind of human response. But narratives of violence or narratives of blame, just as Nita has mentioned, uh, go out of the society in which they operate, and they are systemically engendered. And as we are talking of blaming women or victim blaming, and the victim in this case is women, we are talking of patriarchal systems where the woman is in a subordinate position. She is less likely to be heard. She's always already guilty in a way, because the cornerstone of patriarchy is based on the control and uh, on the control of women's productive and reproductive capacities. इसमें वो
Mm.
sexuality भी आ जाती है and other behavior also. So the frame is tilted as it were, and after that, the blame operationalizes across the multiple axes of gender we've talked about, of class. A rich woman is more likely to be heard than a poor man, but a rich woman is as likely to be raped by a poor man as she is by a rich woman. So her vulnerability cuts across class, but the allocation of blame is uh, inflected by the class factor. Uh, where women are concerned, blaming has many techniques, and one of one of them, which I find very interesting, is to deflect attention from the crime that has taken place or the offense that has taken place by shifting the attention to something else. And I mean, immediately I can think of Noor Muqaddam, because that is such an immediate case. I mean, attention from a horrendous murder was diverted to what was she doing over there? Why did she decide? Did her parents know where she was? She's going against our culture. She's going against our religion, and in the process, Noor becomes somewhere not the person to be blamed, but the one who is getting the blame, and it's
Mm. Mm.
effective. Similarly, in in other cases, like the motorway case, the woman is gang raped. It is obviously negligence on part of the police, but the thing was, what was she doing there? Why didn't she check her fuel tank? Why didn't she go via the GT road? Why did she take a less traveled road? You know, so, and because women are in a position of disempowerment. They are in a position of uh, where their blame as far as women go normally is linked to morality, sexual morality, and
Hmm.
because वो उसको we give it such a, it is valorized so much, it is so central to a woman's identity. I mean, and technically we say what is wrong for a woman is wrong for a man, but a man may do things that a woman is not allowed to do. They become
Hmm.
more immoral when she does them. And blame operates around that axis. And then there is the
Yes.
language of blame. There's the language of blame which distances. If I was looking at this paper by Zainab Zishan Malik the other day, and she talks about it that agency, which is technically with the man in patriarchy, is shifted to the victim. She got
Hmm.
raped. ये नहीं कि I raped her, she
Hmm.
got,
Yes.
she was found over there. She was attacked. And the
It
perpetrator
never talks about, yes, you're absolutely spot
is
on.
kept
Even
out of
when
the
media
court.
is reporting, the onus of the whole incidence is on the woman because she got raped, and it's something which has perhaps damaged her honor, and she's now who's broken, and even then she is to be blamed for that. But Fawzia, if I may bring this to you, all things pointed out, I agree with everything that Neelamji has said. But we've all seen, people in position, people who are supposed to be making the laws and the legal system and the support system more effective, dodge the bullet. I've often had politicians and law enforcement representatives on my show who would indulge in victim blaming, and then it would become a hue and cry on social media. But it only points to the fact that this victim blaming is so deeply ingrained and internalized. Can we do enough, and what can we do to actually take that away and make it a perhaps more safe place for women, in your opinion?
It's a very big question, Sidra, and perhaps even this 1.5 hour or 1 hour wouldn't be able to address it. But let me first of all tie it all back to the politics of power, and to talk about violence in society. Violence in society, just to reiterate what Neelam and Sidra had said, is perpetrated on men and women both. It happens by the person who is in power on the person who is not in power. Um, Harassment, if you take the example of harassment, harassment can happen, even sexual harassment can happen on men and women both. But the operative dynamic over here is power that we've talked about. In
Hmm.
our society, unfortunately, I'm just repeating what's being said, but I want to do it in a little more factual way. In our society, unfortunately, power lies with men. And that's why
Hmm.
when we talk about violence, when we talk about harassment also, it is synonymous with the general situation which is perpetrated on women and not as much on men. That's why we're talking about that. And that is then translated into cultural disempowerment, systemic disempowerment, institutional disempowerment, and a complete lack of support at all these levels. Let me just take a small example of the issue of harassment. In the first incident, there is the highly stereotyped gender roles which have been imposed on men and women both. Even like earlier on, we were discussing that men who are not masculine enough are stigmatized, right? And the power then goes to people who are most masculine and who fulfill this very
Hmm.
macho, hyper masculine male, right?
Hmm.
Women who are not feminine enough are stigmatized. Along with that comes a whole set of SOPs on how women and men should behave, right? And this ties in with the women's role in the house and not outside the house. So when a woman goes outside the house for whatever purposes, she's inviting that. She's inviting violence upon her, whether it is in the form of harassment, or it is in the form of rape, or in the form of institutional and systemic discrimination. She has
Hmm.
chosen that path, right? So therefore, this translation of that mindset, which is essentially tied with keeping your privileges, that disempowers women. Now, just to come quickly to your the latter part of your question.
Yeah.
What happens and what can be done, right? What can be done, maybe we can deal with a little bit later, but what happens, First of all, we have laws. In fact, we are a hyper legislated society. Please remember that. We have laws for everything. We have a very strong law, to take the example of harassment, on harassment also. In 2010, the law was passed. It filtered down to provinces when provincial autonomy was made great, or devolution happened. We have laws on violence against women in the Pakistan Penal Code. We have laws on, especially on rape, the most heinous form of violence against women. But that law is in the hands of people who have internalized sexism, right? By the way, both men and women, because women also feel that if a woman is stepping outside the house, if she's dressed in a certain manner, she's inviting violence upon herself, So that internalized sexism then translates into that denial of the space to women to come into any sphere. I'm sure you've experienced that in the media also. So Anida's experienced that in the field of law for sure. And ultimately translates into lower numbers of women in public spheres, poor implementation of law. And maybe we can give some time to this implementation of law, which really is what disempowers women, So then later, maybe what can be done, right?
Very true, Fawzi. That's a very strong point. I just want to remind all my panelists that while you're not speaking, if I may request you to kindly put yourself on mute for the sake of clarity of this transmission. Fawzi ji, I just want to segue into your, another question into your statement. You pointed out that the operative factor here is power, and every time we unpack it and we are having a conversation, a reasonable conversation, we understand it. But to the common man, the conversation or the operative factor is temptation, just like you mentioned, the internalized sexism or the sexuality, the concept of it. So, I mean, is this really a woman's fault that men find her tempting? And is a man really so bizarrely, moved to crime, to actually, being violent when he's tempted? I mean, this is the part that we don't understand. And unfortunately, even from the highest offices, there seems to be confusion about that, because it seems to be part of our culture that if women dress a certain way, men will respond violently. What's your take on that?
Absolutely. As I told you earlier, I'm conducting some sort of training for about over 700 officials in the education sector, by the way. Very sympathetic. We talk about harassment. And when I open the floor for questions, the first question is an observation, which is, you know what, if we didn't put women and men together, if we didn't allow women to go out too much, if the women did not dress in a certain manner, things would be better. And my answer to that is, a 3-year-old also gets raped, a boy also gets raped. You can't put it on the woman. It is on yourself. It is essentially the weak writ of law. And that weak writ of law is not because of the weak writ of the state. It is because of the lack of the desire to do so, right? Why is it that it is always on the woman? But when I engage with them, they realize that I realize, one, they are not aware of the law because it is not emphasized enough. I know awareness sometimes is seen as a very weak excuse, and we know that ignorance of law is not an excuse, but it can sometimes be the awareness on the law. And secondly, and here I want to emphasize the role that the misuse of religion is also playing, that ability to separate the public from the private, the confining the woman in the chadar and char diwari, that mindset is very much there, which justifies the victim blaming and the perpetration of power on them. We need to, women like Neelam and myself, you and Nida, we are not enough. We need, Adnan, people like Adnan, and we need others also to make it very clear. In harassment also, for instance, no means no. Please get that right. And a slight, and I'm going to end at this, a slight nuancing of that, or rather clarification over here also, is that if a woman is having, let's say, an affair, to use a very bad term in our society, which is then tied with the religion of not knowing na mera men. If she's having a relationship with a man and it stops, she's ended it for whatever reason. And then if the man approaches her, makes a sexual advance towards her, if she says no, he should understand it as no and not as a legacy no, when sometimes they say nakhra karti. So that sort of a thing, because here the operative word is consent. People need to be made to understand by people like us and the lawmakers and everyone, consent is integral to your entire discussion. I'm going to end it out here and pass on.
I think that's a very, very powerful statement. And sometimes when I'm having a conversation about that in mainstream media, my dilemma is that we don't have appropriate translations, and it's a lot is lost in translation. How do you actually translate consent for people in Pakistan? But Adnan, I want to come to you. There are two very disturbing outcomes whenever harassment or violence against women is reported. Number one, just like all the panelists have reiterated, it is seen as a woman's fault. She was wayward, she did something wrong, and whatever happened is unfortunate, but she sort of brought it upon herself. So she ought to be punished, number one. Secondly, how do you respond to it as a man when most of these heinous crimes are actually painted as crimes of passion? Because the man loved her so much, he just could not, take no for an answer, or he was so smitten by her that when she said no, he had no option but to rape her. How do you respond to that as a man?
Oh, gosh. Well, thank you, first of all, for having me here. And it's a real privilege to be on this panel with such esteemed women. And it's really an honor to learn from all of you. Gosh, that's a big question for me to take on. And I mean, obviously, at a personal level, I'm always, as Fawzia ji was saying, consent is so essential that it just blows my mind when something happens that's completely out of consent, because it's such an act of violence, and then it goes along with the idea of power. So what was the last question you asked me? How do I feel when?
How do you feel when these acts of harassment, these crimes are reported as crimes of passion? Because the man loved her so much, he just couldn't take no for an answer. Or she, yes, your take on that.
Yeah, I think it's something you mentioned earlier. It's about raising consciousness and what does it really mean to be the healthy masculine, right? And I think that is something that's really missing in our society. I think just to give a little framework, and I'd like to address religion, because I think that's how that's a lens through which people look at issues like this. The idea of the soul, even in religious traditions generally, doesn't have a gender. So it's both masculine and feminine. And so when we come into our bodies, that's when we become gendered, or we have, we're defined as men or women. But I just find that the way men are then raised here, they're not they through society and through their own parenting and through bullying around them and other men, they are not allowed really to be emotional. They're not allowed to really vent. And so I feel like it's not a justification at all. It's just a sort of anthropological insight, is that there's this, they don't know how to hear no. Boys are generally not taught how to say no. So then when you see these crimes of passion, it's usually by these man-child, most of the men in our society, unfortunately, not all, but a lot of them don't grow up properly. They don't learn their boundaries. They don't learn when someone says no. And every whim is catered to. We hear this so often, that a boy growing up in a house has very different rules than a girl growing up in the house. And they might be the same age, or, so that starts very early. And I think what ends up happening is, because the boy is not used to hearing a no, that's where the crime of sort of passion comes. And I think it's just irresponsibility. It's irresponsible the way that these boys have been raised. And sometimes some might say, well, they don't know any better. And that's a shame, because I think, that's the role of education. That's the role of parenting. That's the role of, even media and television. But because we are a patriarchal culture, and because that is what is sort of enshrined almost in our national ethos, that is what ends up being, and it becomes justified, because then it's always like you said earlier, it's always usually the woman's fault. because it's a crime of passion, and had she said yes, and why did she do this, and I had the right to kill her. And then I think it comes to the idea of honor and appropriation, where men feel like they can control women's bodies and they can control women's minds, and actually that women are subservient in some way to men. And again, that is not, I mean, I like to cite this example. I think everyone forgets about like Hazrat Khatija. Like, no one really talks about her. And look at that relationship. When you talk and you quote religion, it's a strong, independent woman that our Prophet, peace be upon him, worked for, married her. She proposed to him. So there's all this also history. And I don't like using religion, but I think it is an important part to bring in, because I think that is how people look at things. So actually, I mean, I think we as men really need to do some deep soul work and some deep identity work, because actually we're not happy. I mean, I can speak for men more than I can speak for women. And I generally find it's all, there's so much frustration. I mean, highest suicide rates of men between 25 and 40. There's epic frustration, and we're not able to channel it. And then it comes out in these crimes and in this kind of behavior, which is completely unacceptable as far as I'm concerned. Can't hear you.
Adnan, very right. I think what I'm hearing is that there is a gender disbalance, and we sometimes paint men to be these beasts who have no emotions and who perhaps moving from one prey to the other, and they're rather predatory in their approach. But the fact remains that, harassment against women and these violent acts is not a question of men against women. Nida, in your practice, what do you notice? At times when you probe a case, you find out that perhaps the instigation comes from women. A man perhaps could have committed the crime, but there are threads that tie up to secondary perpetrators. I mean, usually in the case of a woman being beaten by her husband, we see that the mother-in-law or the sisters-in-law had a role to play. So are women actually supportive of women, and all crime and all violent acts can actually, are instigated by men alone, in your opinion?
Well, I think that's a very important observation, because, we always tend to look at these things from the lens of biological sexes, so men versus women, whereas these are matters of internalized misogyny or internalized patriarchy, as we say. And therefore, women are equally and just as much susceptible to it. And, I would like to get into a bit, I would like to sort of discuss why this happens in the first place, because like today, we have all this technology and all this access to resources and a counter narrative and alternative point of views through which, there's a lot more education or tools through which we can sort of, find out about an alternative narrative. And we know all these fancy terms such as victim blaming and all of that. But this is not something new. And this has been happening since, recorded history. And as I've mentioned earlier, that these are narratives that have been sort of peddled and handed down over, years and years and years, so much so that they're now part of, they've been embedded into our culture through religion, through other moral value systems. And therefore, women are obviously, in that power dynamic, they are also part of the same society, right? So they've also been brought up with the same sort of value system that has been put in place deliberately so that the status quo can be maintained. I mean, the same value system that teaches men to be macho or to not take no for an answer or whatever. I mean, it's the same, but in reverse for women. And so, it's the conditioning also is both ways, right? So, I mean, and I feel that, for us, till a certain generation, it was unfortunate that that kind of access to the technology or information that we have now, maybe it wasn't as readily accessible to them. And even then we had women like Miss Neelam and like Miss Fawzia and like all our seniors who had been sort of trying to come up with that alternative narrative. And what happened with them? They were stigmatized in a bid to disarm them, in a bid to sort of again create that binary or that of us versus them, or a good woman and a bad woman. So all of these are ultimately again based on, and they come from the same power dynamic. And women, because they're disarmed and they're disempowered financially, they don't have access or control over their own finances, or they don't even have, like, sometimes their inheritance is also denied, so they don't even have they don't have they're not given at the same level of education. So all of these social factors also add to how the men sort of maintain that status quo and power
Very
imbalance,
true.
keep women uh, in check. And so
Very
this,
true.
they also keep repeating that same narrative that
Yeah.
has been held down.
Nida, there's something very interesting that you mentioned when you talked about when women raise their voice. I think if I look at the general population, we seem to be very polarized in our thoughts. I mean, the level of bewilderment that some of these harassment cases, or when a woman is reporting domestic violence, even from her immediate family, is astonishing, because at times women would turn around, or family would turn around and say, "Isme kya badi baat hai? Ye to hota aaya hai." So it's pointing to the fact that it's been happening since generations. We've internalized the trauma, we've taken it to be the norm. And every time you raise your voice about that, Neelamji, I'd like to bring this one to you. You're seen as a wayward woman. In fact, recently, when we've started having this discourse, people pick things up, and it's like it pricks them like a thorn. Like, out of the entire movement around Aurat March and women and the marginalized communities coming out to voice and say that, okay, these are our basic human rights, what was picked up was Mera Jism Meri Marzi. How dare she says that she has complete autonomy over her own body. So why is it, every time we talk about the basic human rights for women and stronger laws to protect her against violence and harassment, it's taken as this new wayward trend of the big bad F word of feminism? What's your call?
Yeah. Well, I'm glad you picked up Mera Jism Meri Marzi, because Mera Jism Meri Marzi happened side by side with the Labbaik Jalus, in which the most filthy abuse was hurled at women. And yeah, there was a bit of shock among the more respectable classes, but not really condemnation. And it went with an undercurrent of amusement, but because that is the language that is the cultural language of our society. From the littlest boy to the Chief Justice or to the PM, the language of abuse is common parlance. What happens with Mera Jism Meri Marzi is, I was very interested that we had this press conference in which one of the media people asked me, "Okay, do you own this slogan?" And I think he was attacking me, and he expected me to say, "No, no, I didn't, And I said, "Yes." And then we all started thumping the thing and saying, "Mera Jism Meri Marzi." It's an inability to, I think, genuinely understand what we were saying, that we were talking of bodily integrity, whereas it was being interpreted as a call for sexual promiscuity. In fact, it was the opposite. It was saying, "Hands off my body." But if you look at some of the uh, social media videos I saw at that time of these men actually saying, कि अच्छा, you want मेरा जिस्म मेरी मर्जी, फिर मैं ये तुम्हारे साथ करता हूँ. And I think it's the inability to understand and accept that a woman owns her own body, because up until now we have not owned our own bodies. Discursively, in practical terms, when a woman is married, norm jo hai, the proposal comes, the families decide, she's picked up, bundled this bundle with her dowry ka potli, and handed over from one man to the other. She loses her name, she loses her home. And that will bring me to your other question of mother-in-law violence. She goes to this new home, and her job is to provide all services, including sexual services, and to continue the line so that the inheritance can pass from father to son. The man's role is to give her a roof over her head and food. And I mean, I'm not saying it's not an unloving relationship. Marriage, there is a lot of love there, but there is a power dynamic also. And and the male fear that the child should be his and not somebody else's. Because, I mean, one of the cruel jokes of nature is that maternity is a fact, paternity is guesswork until testing comes in. So the controls also on her mobility, on who she speaks to. But anyway, to come back to the son, the woman is not secure in her home till that son arrives. It's not that she doesn't love her daughter, but the son is the one who gives her validity. Otherwise, she can be divorced. In our cultures, the man can marry again. And so the son preference and the dream that my son, when he grows up, will love me, value me the way I have not been valued. And when that son marries, and this other woman comes in with the same expectations of her husband as the mother came in with of her husband, then there are two women and one source of resources and authority and pleasure and power and everything. So there is an antagonism, an inbuilt systemic antagonism. I've always cited that one reason why my sister-in-law and I have a very good relationship is that we both work. We both are economically not dependent on each other. And so when we come home, we do share the same space. It's more to share what happened at work or to share a funny story or a joke. We honestly don't have to the time to point out कि उसने बोटी खाई या मैंने आलू खाया या क्या किया. It doesn't happen. So the system, there have to be changes in the systemic arrangements. It is
I
not
absolutely,
time,
yes.
but ये एक factor है. But it's a
Right.
very, very complex situation. And I think
True.
media comes in.
Very true. Before media, Neelamji, I want to go back to, when an act of abuse, harassment, or violence happens. I mean, if we break down the whole process of how it's reported, when it's reported, again, the victim blaming begins at that very point. Fauzi, sometimes, I mean, psychologically, we accept that there is going to be the fight, flight, freeze mode for a victim. A lot of times, the victim is in denial. Sometimes the harassment or the abuse is escalating over time. Initially, you're probably gaslighted, you're missing the red flags, etc., etc. But in your practice, when you work within organizations, within companies, even with government departments, why is it, we have this confusion around what an honorable woman's reaction should be to abuse, especially in the workplace. I mean, every time a woman has come out and reported it, maybe after a month, and she says, okay, this has been going on for a month, the first question she is asked is, why did you tolerate it for a month? Why did you not come in sooner? Etc., etc. And then her whole character and her whole demeanor and all her practices and choices, etc., are put in question. Do you think we are learning as a society? Are we even understanding what a victim goes through so that we can make some responsive and more responsible mechanisms for victims to come forward?
Absolutely. I think sometimes we overcomplicate matters. If a woman has gone through violence or even a man has gone through a certain level of violence, the simple solution is to fix the system, the whole range of fixed system from beginning to end. And really, it does not require serious researches into it. It only requires resourcing of institutional supports. A lot of the times, the lack of institutional supports is what forces a woman to stay silent on gender-based violence. It is not the fact that she doesn't want to come out. Yes, many cultural factors, the blame, the victim blaming, the whole notion of a good woman versus bad woman does come in, but she would still go ahead and report if she had the institutional support. And let me tell you what those are. First of all, if she needs to report, she should have some autonomy on her own life, which can translate into simple things like having an access to a mobile phone at all times, right? Hence the access to mobile phones. Simple things. Control over her own mobile phone. The ability to pay its bill, Sometimes you'll be surprised. A lot of times you'll be surprised. Women cannot make the call. They don't own the mobile phone. They don't have control over it, etc., etc. That's the first thing, She makes a call. Then she has to, let's say, go to the police station. 90% of your women do not have the means of transportation, their own, or effective enough, suitable enough, safe enough means of transportation, public infrastructure also, to be able to go there. Anyway, she somehow goes there, to the police. What In the police station, there are no women police desks. We keep talking about the need for women police stations. We do not need women police stations. We need a police desk in every thana of our country. Because a woman, if I am, God forbid, attacked close to my home, which is around the Mall Road area, I don't need to go to Johor town. It's highly inconvenient for me, even as a woman of means, to be able to go all the way there. So I need a desk, a women's police desk in the Shadman police station, which is right next to me, right? Like any other citizen. Because I'm a citizen also, I should have sympathetic services. And that desk should be resourced by sympathetic, trained, capable police officers for whom money has gone into their training, induction as well as promotion training, for whom there is accountability, because the police officer must be held accountable for his or her actions. And that comes in the performance appraisal that happens every year, right? Why are gender indicators not in the performance appraisal of these police officers? So that is the other aspect. You have your legal aid, the legal system, which is a very complex system to navigate. And Nida and Neelam must both know, and I'm sure Adnan also, they must all know about it. Even an educated person finds it very hard to navigate that complex legal system. To begin with, you need money, right? You need money to hire a good lawyer, because average lawyer has hundreds of cases, cannot do justice unless you have the money to hire a better lawyer, especially when it comes to gender-based violence, where the system is stacked against you. So legal aid, quality legal aid, is what the state needs to provide, and not just for physical violence against women, but also for financial violence against women, which means that only criminal matters must not be supported. Women should not only be supported through criminal matters, but also through civil matters. Custody of children, for example, the ability to get not alimony, but maintenance, as they say, right? Because alimony we don't have. If you get divorced, you walk out with nothing, because the system does not support that you should get any share for your contribution over
Faziti,
10 years of abuse.
if you would
Sorry.
allow me to interject just once, I want you to also comment on the fact that do women in Pakistan have the legal protection to get a restraining order against someone they feel threatened by? Because that's a big question mark for me. All across the world, if you're feeling that, violence is escalating, you're feeling threatened, you're feeling vulnerable, you can ask for a restraining order. Unfortunately, in Pakistan, I'm told that we have no such service. Please, if you could comment on that.
So probably Nida can also speak to it, but I know that if you're a victim of domestic violence, then in 2 provinces you have the law which provides you with the ability to get a restraining order, in Punjab and in Sindh. But the problem in Punjab is that in order to enforce the law, which was to be enforced, which was passed in 2016, the Domestic Violence Prevention and Protection Act, passed in 2016, you could get a series of supports from that, but it was to be implemented in phases, and for that, an entire institutional infrastructure had to be erected. It was only erected in one district of Punjab, in Multan, where you had the Violence Against Women Center, etc., and protection officers. So to answer your question simply, really no. And maybe Nida can also add on to it. But I just want to wrap up, and I know I'm going into a rant. Quickly, what I'm just saying is that even if a woman pursues her case in the court, which is a highly hostile court, where you only see men and not women, after that, and to get immediate protection, sometimes she needs to go into a shelter. A shelter, Darul Aman, is not a place where you can go, or I can go, or Nida can go, or Neelam can go, because it is highly under-resourced. You do not have access to government housing. I lived abroad, and over there in that country, there was a long line for social protection, or for social supports, especially housing. But if you were a victim of domestic violence, you were bumped up to the top of the list to get the housing, which is very good housing. If you had 3 kids, you've got a 3-bedroom house in a good locality. So this is where we are sending a message. Violence against women is not a priority, and it will not be resourced. So you can stay in your home quietly.
In fact, You're absolutely spot on. In fact, the agency of a woman is completely curbed. I mean, the first respondents, if the police is coming to rescue you and if there's domestic violence reported, I mean, even the neighborhood and the family sees the police as a home wrecker. Sometimes the police themselves are going through that confusion that हमने सुलह करवानी है या हमने rescue करना है, हमने बंदे को पकड़ के जेल में डालना है. अच्छा, Adnan, I want to come to you. There's a very interesting notion that yes, men and society at large do not clearly understand what a woman's consent means. But when, a harassment or a case of abuse is reported, they try to paint it all as consensual, and that's much easier to do. For example, if a woman is raped, then the entire timeline is sort of reviewed and said, but she agreed to have tea with him, but she agreed to sit in the same office with him, but she had these so many WhatsApp exchanges with him. So I mean, are we really that naive, or do you see that as a very toxic form of victim blaming as well?
Yeah, 100%. I think it is it's a toxic form of victim blaming. I think it's important that that men and women learn at a very young age, actually, because unfortunately the nature of the way things are here is that there's a lot of sexual predators for young children as well, both men and women. So to be taught consent and to be able to how to receive a no also. So I've been doing a lot of workshops recently and doing a lot of kind of embodied work, and especially around gender. And one of the games that we have is like you every time you want to say something, or if you want to touch somebody, or you ask them, and if the person on the other side says no, you turn to them and you're like, okay, thank you for taking care of yourself. Something as basic as that you could teach 5 or 6 year olds, really. So it's a basic manner. So men also get used to having some sense of a responsibility for every step that they want to take with somebody. Unfortunately, हमारे यहाँ वही है ना कि if a woman is now married to you, then that you don't need to ask her as a man for her consent for sexuality, for example, if they want to engage in any kind of sexual activity. And that's it's such a violation of people's moods and feelings. We're all organic beings. We're changing all the time. What I might have said yesterday may not be how I feel today. So absolutely, I think it's totally unjustifiable. And I think, again, learning consent is so important. When to touch, how to touch, what is a good touch, how far can you go, even with words and wordplay. And unfortunately, I've noticed the way, I'm not, again, there's no blame going. I think men don't know how to receive a no. And then I think, unfortunately, in patriarchal norms, even where the mother has internalized patriarchy, she also teaches her daughter to not say no. Okay, and say no, but it can mean yeah, so there's a lot of confusion around what is a no and what is a yes, because women are taught to please from a very young age. So, young girls are taught, don't make him angry, or if it's a chacha, like if he asks you to sit on his lap, for example, so unfortunately, there's just so much at play. And again, I really wish that this was started at a much earlier age, because I think that's really where you can really ingrain these values in especially men, because I think boys and girls, for me, up to the age of 6, 7, 8 are quite similar generally, and they could treat it differently, but they're playing together. And as soon as it's before puberty, I think they're separated, and men get this boys get this inflated sense of value of who they are, and that they don't have to receive a no, and women become more pleasing and subservient. So if there was a way to kind of really inculcate it at that age. Can't hear you, sorry.
So, Nan, I think for each of us, this has been a journey. We've all gathered so much more experience. We've gone through life, and we've realized how it is around us and it's normalized. If I was to actually ask you about your personal take, every woman in the room can perhaps report of some kind of harassment, abuse, and violence. As a man, were you ever able to witness something and then you saw it being brushed under the carpet as ye to hota hai, ye to norm hai? Maybe she was asking for it. And what was your, internal reaction to it? What was your gut feeling about such a situation?
Well, thank you for asking. It's yeah, it's happened to all the women around me, from from within my family as well. Again, and coming from a, well, sort of an exposed family where all the women work, my mom works, my sister works. Hearing stories later, many years later, that this happened, but we didn't say it, and then it gets triggered at a different point, having a different conversation. It kind of comes up, like the Noor Muqaddam thing really brought up a lot, and I learned things about my family I had no idea about, actually, and it made me angry. And it was like, well, why wasn't this, and even at that point, it's the same things that Fawzia ji was talking about. It's just like, it's better to brush it under the table, even for people of access and from a, who have material wealth and influence. And I mean, even with me, I mean, there were points when I, as a child, there was not consent with older men as well, who, this kind of molestation or unwanted touch. So, and men have a tough time admitting this because it affects their sort of sense of being macho and being a man. But honestly, now that I do, I mean, I'm doing a lot more men's work and, doing men's circles, which I think are so important. And you end up hearing that 3 out of 5 men had some kind of a non-consensual experience. So, and there's the wounding, and then they're not really allowed to feel that, and then they suppress it, and that's where the anger comes out. I mean, it's such a deep psychological issue, unfortunately, and it's just not addressed. And because we are patriarchal, because men are supposed to behave a certain way, then that's like, they're taught that to be angry is the way to behave. Anger is the only emotion that's valid for us, unfortunately. And I think that also needs to change. And unfortunately, it's not a justification at all. I mean, we need to take responsibility for ourselves, and we definitely need to take responsibility as we are. I mean, I hope that I wish for society to be more equal, but at this stage, if it is that way, and men are holding a container for women, that we are more empathetic, and that we actually are able to also see the problems and not look at women as objects that we own, but as fully consensual beings who are, have tremendous beauty. And actually, I mean, for me, I really honor women. I think that's where creation comes from. It's from the feminine, So I think our sense of identity around gender is really skewed.
But Adnan, is that like swimming upstream? I mean, when you say that men have to become more compassionate, when you start practicing that, just like you pointed out, and a number of our panelists pointed out, that seemed to be, or that is defined to be, a weaker man. How do we continue moving in that direction with that kind of societal pressure?
I think we have to change the way we write our stories, really. I mean, this is, I guess, where I can talk about my experience. I think the way the archetypal hero's journey, and the way men succeed, and there's battle and there's violence. Again, I'm going to take an example from the dominant religion in our country, Islam. When they talk about jihad, it's the inner jihad, and what does that really mean? It's the inner jihad has a higher value than the external jihad. It doesn't mean go fight people. It means actually, take the shaitan out or take the ego away. And I think once you start changing those stories and you start showing like the value of compassion and change the idea of what a man needs to be. And actually, men suffer from patriarchy also. Like, we are victims of our own patriarchy. I mean, that's the thing about like what we've created. Like, it stops us from being full human beings. We're so caught in one way. We have to be successful. I have to compete with other men to be successful. You're going to get bullied. We're disconnected from our partners emotionally. We look at we're people who just earn money, provide, and have no emotional connection to our families. These are the values that are put out.
And
Yeah,
sometimes there's political, and sometimes there can be political gains attached to that, having that mindset as well. I mean, there are votes that need to be earned, and more importantly, constituencies that need to be secured. Neelamji, there's one question that has come while people are watching us online. They say, how do you respond and react to the Prime Minister's comment about the women's attire being responsible for sexual harassment and for incidents of violence?
How can one react to it? It's a very crass remark. I mean, it's, apart from being crass, coming from him, it is an extremely dangerous remark. He is head of the government, he's head of state, he's in a position of responsibility. His voice carries a certain amount of weight, or should. I mean, if he loses that weight himself, then he's responsible for it. But to say that, and it's an insult to both women and men. You are telling women, you provoke the men, you ask I mean, it's feeding into the old stereotype of she asked for it, so she got raped, or she provoked me. It's the same blame game. But what is he doing to the men? Are they robots? He said they're not robots, but actually he is making them into robots. Okay, you press a button and they will react in a certain way. For God's sake, I mean, everyone knows pretty decent thinking human men and not all of them go around rape. I mean, it's the radical feminist position that I have disagreed with always, which says that all men are potential rapists. No,
And
you
Sidra,
can't,
sorry, go
you
on.
can't reduce it to biology. These are conscious choices and conscious acts, and by saying a man will react in a certain way if you dress in a certain way, it is to take away his choice from him. So it is an insult to the men, and it is a threat to the women. I mean, in one fell swoop, एक gloves के साथ उसने दोनों को decimate कर दिया. Oh, well.
If I can just add one sentence to Neelam's comment,
जी
you know,
जी
our
बिल्कुल फौजिया
decision
जी
makers, a lot of our decision makers take their cues from the leadership at the top, the political leadership. When you give a rape apology like this, then essentially you're sending the message to the entire bureaucracy, the civil service. It is the decision makers in civil bureaucracy, including the police and judiciary also, that it's okay. And it reverses the gains that we have made over the past decades. Because
in
they,
fact
even
जी
if they don't believe it, they will still follow it. They will
Very
follow that
true.
political.
Faziji, we are into the last 4 minutes of this conversation, but I cannot help but bring in the social media angle into this conversation, especially the women who are public figures. It's almost like, I hate this sentence, but I often hear that you're not a public figure, you're public property. This is the most insulting kind of a comment that can come through, but they almost feel that if a woman is in the public eye or she's public facing, she's again asking for it. She's fair game. She can be criticized, she can be trolled. We've seen some really dangerous trends online, on Twitter especially, where there have been abuses being hurled at women journalists, and there is no reprimanding of that from the government level. Government, in fact, tries to break down journalists who are sensed to be critiquing them by making it into this fair game, attack her all the way kind of a conversation. What's your take on that, please?
Absolutely. And it's aimed at the media. It is aimed at political figures also, by the way. Women parliamentarians have told us that many a times they have been discouraged by their own families not to stay in politics. First, not to come into politics, and then not to stay in politics, because there is such a lot of character assassination. There is such a lot of loose blaming, which everybody buys into, because we still haven't understood that the power of social media can work both ways. It can go for you and it can go against you. And if there are no checks and balances, if there is no moderating that social media, it's going to be that genie out of the bottle, which we'll never be able to control. So that can be a very powerful thing. And I hope that we can stop the abuse of social media against
Very
women.
true. Nida, there have been conversations around how can we actually take away the anonymous troll armies that people have. These couldn't be bot attacks, but people are saying that only verified accounts should be a part of the social media discourse. Now, there is no real physical violence that has happened, but there's a lot of emotional trauma, there's a lot of abuse, and there is real threat as well. I mean, we've recently had Virat Kohli's 10-month-old baby getting rape threats. I mean, it's a dangerous world for women out there. What's your take on it? How does the legal system look at social media abuse and trolling?
I wanted to say this a while ago as well, and I think I'll connect it to this last point and end it there. You see, victim blaming doesn't just harm the person in question. And when we continue with this practice, what we're essentially creating is a society that chooses to place the blame where it doesn't lie, and in turn keeps on creating unsafe spaces for everyone. So no one is safe until
Yes.
everyone is safe. So it's very
Yes.
important to, hold the perpetrator accountable, as opposed to just, basking in this false sense of security that, by accepting that, if you don't act like the victim, or if you don't wear certain
Very
clothes, or
true.
if you're not found in a certain place, you will be able to safeguard yourself. No.
Brilliantly captured.
Yeah.
Thank you, Nida, for that. Thank you, Adnan Malik. Thank you, Neelam ji and Fawzia ji, for joining us for this conversation. We're into the final 30 seconds, but we've had a lot of texture, a lot of angles, a lot of meat in this conversation. I'd like to thank you for that. And it's up on the SOT events as well as on Facebook for other people's consumption. If you're watching it later, please use the hashtag replay and do direct your question to us. It was an absolute pleasure and honor to have this conversation with all my panelists. I thank you once again. I thank the Beacon House Network for putting up a great show and for having us over on the School of Tomorrow. May we go forward and do away with these negative trends and these malpractices. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you, Sidra, for brilliantly hosting this program.